Well, folks, we left off with lesson 39. And let me tell you, we were in quite a dilemma. You see, Rome was at the brink of civil war. Julius Caesar, their great hero, had a year before declared himself dictator of Rome for life. The Senate did not like that at all. In fact, 60 of the members got together and planned the assassination of Julius Caesar. As they had invited him to a dinner meal, he came in, a lot of them had been his very close friends. He was stabbed 23 times on the Ides of March. But Julius did not leave anyone to be in charge if he was killed. So what do? Do they find an heir? Well, he did have one son by the Egyptian princess queen Cleopatra, but his son then would only be 4 years old. So as they looked, they were wondering, what should they do? And of course, the members of the Senate that had assassinated him had fled and ran. So now the Senate was totally in a mess. So as they got together, they realized that he did have one nephew that he considered as his son. And this nephew at the time was 18 years old. And he was kind of sickly, and he didn't really have much of military experience. Before I said he was kind of a brat. Well, I wouldn't call him that. He was very intelligent, and he was a very conniving young man. I'm just saying that. As we go in time, we'll find out more about him. But then the Senate then thinking, well, we should have another triumvirate. So they organized this with Octavian. Later on, they would give him the name of Augustus Caesar. In fact, Octavian took quite a few different names because he didn't really want to be known as Octavian. He wanted to be known as Julius Caesar's heir. Marcus Lepidus was another man who was like one of Julius Caesar's so-called general. He too was a military man. Mark Antony was Julius Caesar's, one of his closest friends, his top generals, and also he too was related to Julius Caesar. And we'll see what happens. You can see the hint there of Cleopatra, can't you? So we have this triumvirate forming, don't we? And so how are they going to get along? The previous ones never did get along, did they? So it was about 7 years later that Octavian defeats Marcus Lepidus. He actually doesn't so-called defeat him. He goes in and pays his soldiers more to desert and come to his side, and then he takes away Mark Lepidus's titles, any titles that he has, and he forces him to retire. So he doesn't kill him. But now the triumvirate is gone. So what happens then? And Augustus, Octavian, Augustus Caesar is thinking about taking over Rome. Meanwhile, we still have Mark Antony. Well, let's go back a little bit. What happens with Mark Antony? Well, Mark Antony is really not too wild about Octavian at all. He thinks he's just a boy. In fact, Mark Antony says to him, "You boy owe everything to your name." He's saying the only reason that he's there is because of his name, that he took the name of Julius Caesar. So he right away, they are not really agreeable on everything. But Mark Antony, where does he go to rule? They divide the kingdom up, and he goes and gets the part where Egypt is. And as he goes into Egypt, he is met by this beautiful ship that comes. His soldiers are just there. They've camped out there in Africa on the Mediterranean Sea, and this ship comes in, and it's beautiful. It's gold with silk hanging from the sails, and the sails are all dipped in perfume. And most of the people on the boat are not really sailors, but they're beautiful women. And as the ship pulls in, and Mark Antony and his soldiers see, it is Cleopatra. And she's come to greet them, and she's brought them a feast. And they are so, so happy. So as they board the ship and everything, she meets Mark Antony. Now, she has met him before. And actually before, she kind of liked him then, I think. But they actually, get along quite well. And she tells him that she wants to give her full alliance to Mark Antony as the new Caesar to rule, and to rule her country. He's very happy with that. And he was about to go on to conquering some other countries down toward the Middle East, and he decides to stay in Egypt. And they have this really intimate allegiance with each other. In fact, they fall in love. Mark Antony decides to stay there. Now his wife, he had a wife, but his wife Flavia had just passed away. So in the midst of all this, Octavian calls him back to Rome for business. He goes back to Rome. Octavian, being very wise, thinks, oh, I know. He really is attracted to Cleopatra. He had heard of her, and he had known her from his uncle, Julius Caesar, of course. And so he does not want that to happen. So as he comes, he says, now for political alliance, this is what you're going to have to do, and you will have my support. Octavian says this to Mark Antony. You will have to marry my sister Octavia. He's not really wild about that. But he says if it will help the country stay together, we will have a political marriage. And then he takes off. Where does he go? He goes back to Egypt with Cleopatra. And he stays there for most of the time. In fact, when he goes back a couple years later, he actually divorces Octavia. In the meantime, going back, he marries Cleopatra. They have a big Egyptian wedding. In fact, he brings his sons to be with them in Egypt. At least one son, I know for sure. And they also have children. Within the 11 years that he's there, he has 3 children. One set of twins, a boy and a girl, and then a baby boy. They got their whole family going. And Octavian really, really doesn't like much about this. And in fact, he finds out later, Octavian finds out by confiscating Mark Antony's will from the so-called temple area. He found, and he reads it in front of the Senate. What does his will say? Well, it basically declares that Cleopatra's son, who is Julius Caesar's son, they call him Caesar Ptolemy, would be the next heir. It also says that he wouldn't come back to Rome, and that they would be buried in the temples of Egypt, which Rome would just make them sick. He was more of an Egyptian than he was a Roman. And he also aligned and said that he did not really accept Octavian as the ruler of Rome. So, and another thing he does, he gives the territories that he owns there, that he thinks he owns in Egypt, to his sons. Octavian doesn't like that. Neither does the Senate. the Senate has already been kind of picked by Octavian himself, and Octavian has gone to the Senate and basically said, you have the power and not me, which he really had the power. He really knew how to play people like pawns on a chessboard, though he was so young. So, he decides, and this is not until about 11 years later, he decides to attack and declare war, not on Mark Antony, but on Cleopatra. He sends his greatest general, Agrippa, who is a fantastic general, and they meet at a place called Activa. And they have this all-out naval battle. But most of Mark Antony fights for Cleopatra, but most of the Roman soldiers really, they don't want to fight against other Roman soldiers. And so they kind of just give in. And then Mark Antony has to retreat. And the other end, the Egyptian army with Cleopatra, they're not in sync with the Roman of Mark Antony's either. And so they end up retreating. Octavian wins the battle. So Mark Antony retreats. He thinks that the love of his life, Cleopatra, is dead. He falls on his sword. Some people say he commits suicide, but I mean, if you fall on your sword in your stomach, is that how you do it? I don't think so. I think he was mortally wounded myself. So they bring him to Egypt, and there's Cleopatra, and he dies in Cleopatra's arms. Now, what is Cleopatra going to do? Octavia comes in, and he meets with Cleopatra, and he doesn't want to kill her. And she goes, oh, would you please, please protect my children? Do not kill my children. And he says, I don't know about that yet. You see, one of the big reasons he wanted to attack was to kill little Caesar, Ptolemy Caesar, Julius's son, because he wanted to make sure he would never get power. So as she says that, she's worried. She retreats to her temple, and in her temple, when she's in the temple there of her so-called god, she gets bit by a poisonous snake, and she dies quickly. Now, they're not sure really if the snake did it or she drank poison or what happened, but she died. So Octavian is very upset because he told her he wanted to take her back as a prisoner, and he was going to put a golden collar around her neck with chains and bring her and show her in front of the people and say, hey, this is my pet. She's just like my pet monkey. Not a good thing. So what does he do? Yes, he does. He has little Caesar, who is 14 at the time, and he has him executed. And he also has one of Mark Antony's sons, who's 18, thinking either one of them could take over his position, and has them executed. Now, he could have had the other kids too, but instead he brings them back to Rome, and he parades them around Rome with the golden chains on their neck. And they're thinking probably they're going to be executed. There's twins, a girl and a boy, 10 years old, and a 4-year-old little boy. And he has mercy on them. Well, I don't know if really he had the mercy on them or his sister Octavia did. Because she says, they actually belong to me because I was married to Mark Antony. So I am taking those children as my own. So she takes the twins and the little boy and raises them as her own. In fact, later on, we find some things out about Cleopatra's daughter and how she had married a very prominent Roman. All right, we need to stop a minute, and then we'll go on just a little more before we're done with this subject.